On October 6, 1981, thousands of people gathered in Cairo for a military parade. It was supposed to be a celebration, a commemoration of an Egyptian military victory. Dignitaries sat in the reviewing stand. Military units marched past in perfect formation. The crowd watched as fighter jets flew overhead in V formations, their contrails streaking across the sky. Then, in front of thousands of witnesses, in broad daylight, something happened that would shock the world. A man who had spent decades in power, who had negotiated peace with Israel, who was considered one of the most important political figures in the Middle East, was cut down in a hail of bullets. What happened that day wasn't just an assassination. It was a watershed moment in modern history. It exposed the deep divisions within Egypt. It revealed the vulnerability of even the most heavily guarded leaders. And it set off a chain of events that would reshape the politics of the entire region. Today, we're going to explore how one of the most powerful men in the world was killed in front of thousands of people. We're going to understand who wanted him dead, why they wanted him dead, and what led to the moment when political ideology turned into violence. To understand why Sadat was killed, you need to understand who he was and how he came to power. Anwar Sadat was born in 1918 in a small village in the Nile Delta. He came of age during a time when Egypt was occupied by British forces and struggling for independence. As a young man, Sadat became involved in nationalist movements. He joined the military and participated in various political organizations focused on liberating Egypt from British control. During World War II, he was arrested by British authorities for his involvement in nationalist activities. He spent time in prison, where he had time to think about politics, ideology, and what Egypt's future should be. After the war, Sadat remained politically active. He was part of the movement that eventually led to the Free Officers Movement, a group of military officers who believed Egypt needed fundamental change. In 1952, this movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew the Egyptian monarchy and established a republic. Sadat was one of the key figures in this revolution, and he held various positions in the new government. For nearly 2 decades, Sadat served under Nasser. He was vice president for much of this period, though he remained somewhat in Nasser's shadow. When Nasser died in 1970, Sadat took over as president. Many observers at the time didn't expect him to last long. They thought he was a temporary figure who would soon be replaced by more powerful military officers. But Sadat proved them wrong. Over the next several years, he consolidated power and began implementing his own vision for Egypt. Sadat's most significant move came in 1973, when he launched the Yom Kippur War against Israel. This war was a major military engagement, and while it wasn't a decisive Egyptian victory, it restored Egyptian pride and prestige. For the first time since the 1967 war, Egyptians felt their military had performed honorably. Sadat became a national hero. But then, Sadat did something that would ultimately lead to his assassination. In 1977, he traveled to Israel and became the first Arab leader to visit the country. He did this despite intense opposition from many Arabs who considered Israel an enemy. In 1978 and 1979, he negotiated a peace treaty with Israel, the Camp David Accords. For this, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, alongside Israel's Menachem Begin and U.S. President Jimmy Carter. To many in the Arab world, particularly to Islamic fundamentalist groups and Palestinian activists, this was a betrayal. The Camp David Accords were seen as abandoning the Palestinian cause. Egypt was expelled from the Arab League. Arab states condemned Sadat. Within Egypt itself, opposition groups, particularly Islamic fundamentalist organizations, began viewing Sadat as an enemy to their cause. The peace with Israel had made him powerful internationally, but it had made him increasingly vulnerable domestically. By 1981, Sadat was aware of the growing opposition. He had begun cracking down on dissidents. He arrested hundreds of people: intellectuals, religious leaders, political activists, journalists, anyone he viewed as a potential threat. Some of these arrests happened in September 1981, just weeks before his assassination. But despite the arrests and the security measures, Sadat felt secure enough to attend the military parade on October 6th. To understand why Sadat was killed, you need to understand the groups that opposed him. By 1981, Sadat faced opposition from multiple factions: but the most dangerous came from Islamic fundamentalist organizations. One of the primary groups involved in the assassination plot was called Islamic Jihad. This organization had emerged in the late 1970s, and it was focused on overthrowing Sadat's secular government and establishing an Islamic state in Egypt. The group believed that Egypt's government was un-Islamic and that Sadat's peace with Israel was a fundamental betrayal of Islamic principles. They viewed armed struggle as not just justified, but religiously required. Another important group was the Muslim Brotherhood. While the Brotherhood was primarily an organization focused on Islamic social activism, some of its members had become more radical. The Brotherhood opposed Sadat for his secular policies and his peace with Israel, though the Brotherhood's official stance was less violent than Islamic Jihad's. The ideology that motivated these groups was rooted in a specific interpretation of Islamic texts. They believed that establishing an Islamic state required removing un-Islamic leaders. They saw Sadat as someone who had strayed from Islamic principles. His government was too secular. His peace with Israel violated Islamic duty, and his suppression of Islamic groups showed his hostility to Islam. Therefore, in their view, his removal was justified. What made this ideology particularly dangerous was that it combined religious conviction with political activism. These weren't just political opponents disagreeing about policy. They were religious militants who believed they were fulfilling a divine duty. This meant they were willing to take risks and make sacrifices that ordinary political opponents might not be willing to make. The members of Islamic Jihad who would plan the assassination saw themselves as soldiers in a religious war. They believed that killing Sadat would strike a blow against secular government in Egypt and inspire an Islamic revolution. They thought that his death would be a catalyst for broader change. One of the key figures in planning the assassination was a man named Khalid al-Islambuli. Al-Islambuli was an officer in the Egyptian military, a lieutenant in the artillery corps. This detail is crucial because it meant that someone inside the military, someone with access and authority, was involved in the conspiracy. Al-Islambuli was motivated by Islamic fundamentalist ideology and by anger at what he saw as Sadat's betrayal of Islamic values and the Palestinian cause. Al-Islambuli was part of a cell within the military that had become radicalized. The cell included soldiers and junior officers who were sympathetic to Islamic fundamentalist causes. Through his position in the military, Al-Islambuli had knowledge of security procedures and military operations. He knew how military parades were organized. He knew where security vulnerabilities existed. As opposition to Sadat grew in 1981, these radical military officers began discussing the possibility of removing him. Discussions turned into planning. Planning turned into concrete operational details. By early October 1981, a specific plot had been developed, and the conspirators had begun preparing to execute it. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. During the military parade on October 6th, a military unit would break formation and assassinate Sadat in front of thousands of witnesses. The perpetrators would likely be killed in the immediate aftermath, either by security forces or in the chaos that would follow. But they accepted this. They saw themselves as martyrs, willing to sacrifice their lives for their cause. October 6th, 1981 began like any other day in Cairo, but for those involved in the assassination plot, it was the culmination of weeks of planning. The military parade was scheduled to commemorate the anniversary of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the war that had made Sadat a hero and cemented his power. The parade took place at a military airfield near Cairo. Thousands of military personnel participated. Military vehicles rolled past. Tanks moved in formation. Fighter jets were scheduled to perform aerial maneuvers overhead. It was designed to be an impressive display of Egyptian military power, a show of strength to both the Egyptian people and the international community. The reviewing stand where Sadat sat was elevated, giving him a clear view of the parade passing below. Various dignitaries sat with him: military officers, government officials, foreign diplomats. The stand provided a commanding view of the parade route, but it also made Sadat highly visible. From the parade formations below, anyone in the right position would have a clear sightline to the president. Security was present, but not overwhelming. Egypt in 1981 was still not the security-obsessed state that modern nations have become. There were security personnel around Sadat, but the level of security would not be considered adequate by modern standards. There were no metal detectors at the venue. There were no elaborate screening procedures for military personnel participating in the parade. The assumption was that military soldiers participating in an official military parade would be vetted and trustworthy. This assumption proved to be the security vulnerability that the conspirators had identified. As the parade progressed and the morning wore on, military units continued to march past the reviewing stand. The soldiers were in formation. Officers were calling out commands. The parade had a specific structure and timing. Various military units would pass in sequence. At a particular point during the parade, a truck carrying an artillery unit approached the reviewing stand. The truck was part of the regular parade formation. It seemed unremarkable. No one in the crowd or among the security personnel would have seen anything unusual about it. But inside the truck were the conspirators, members of Islamic Jihad who had positioned themselves to participate in the assassination. As the truck passed near the reviewing stand, several soldiers jumped out of the truck and moved toward the stand. They were armed with automatic weapons. This sudden movement, soldiers leaving the parade formation, would have been immediately noticeable to security personnel. Alarms would have been raised, but by the time security personnel reacted, the soldiers had moved close enough to the reviewing stand. The assassins opened fire. Automatic weapons discharged in rapid bursts. Bullets struck the reviewing stand. Sadat was hit multiple times. Other people on the stand were also struck, government officials and security personnel. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. The security personnel around Sadat immediately moved to protect him and to respond to the attack. There was chaos on the reviewing stand. People were lying down, seeking cover. Some were trying to flee. Security forces were attempting to locate and neutralize the shooters. The assassins, expecting to be killed in the immediate aftermath, continued firing. They wanted to ensure that Sadat was dead and that they had accomplished their mission. They were prepared for the consequence, that they themselves would likely be killed within moments of firing their weapons. Security forces returned fire. The assassins were quickly neutralized. Some were killed in the exchange of gunfire. Others were wounded and captured. The entire incident lasted only minutes, but it left multiple people dead and wounded. Sadat was severely wounded by gunshot wounds. Medical personnel rushed to treat him. There were no surgical facilities at the parade ground, so he needed to be transported to a hospital. An ambulance was called. Sadat was placed in the ambulance and rushed to a nearby military hospital. At the hospital, doctors attempted to save his life. They worked to treat his injuries, manage his bleeding, and keep his vital functions operating. Despite their efforts, Sadat's injuries were too severe. The gunshot wounds had caused extensive internal damage. His body went into shock. His organs began to fail. Approximately an hour after being shot at the parade ground, Anwar Sadat died at the military hospital. The man who had been president of Egypt, who had negotiated peace with Israel, who had won a Nobel Peace Prize, was dead. He was killed by members of his own military, people who had been trained and armed by his own government. The news spread rapidly. Within minutes, the international media was reporting that the president of Egypt had been assassinated. Governments around the world were being notified. The Arab world was reacting with shock, and in some cases, with satisfaction that this man they viewed as a traitor was dead. Egypt itself was thrown into chaos. After Sadat's death, investigators immediately began interrogating those who had been arrested at the scene. The conspiracy unraveled and the identities of the conspirators became known. What emerged was a picture of a network of radical military officers and Islamic fundamentalists who had worked together to plan and execute the assassination. Khalid al-Islambouli, the artillery officer mentioned earlier, was identified as one of the primary conspirators. Al-Islambouli came from a military family. His father had been a general in the Egyptian army, but unlike his father's apparent acceptance of Sadat's government, Khalid had become increasingly radicalized by Islamic fundamentalist ideology. Al-Islambouli's radicalization had been influenced by his exposure to Islamic fundamentalist ideas. He had been influenced by the writings and teachings of Islamic theorists who advocated for armed struggle against secular governments. He had become convinced that Sadat's government was un-Islamic, and that removing Sadat was a religious obligation. There were also personal motivations involved. Al-Islambuli's brother had been arrested by Sadat's government for his involvement in Islamic fundamentalist activities. This personal grievance added to Al-Islambuli's ideological motivations. He saw Sadat not just as a bad leader, but as someone who was personally persecuting his own family for their religious beliefs. The conspiracy also involved other military officers and members of Islamic Jihad. Some of these individuals were radicalized soldiers who believed in the cause. Others were members of Islamic Jihad who had infiltrated the military and recruited sympathetic officers. The conspiracy represented a convergence of military access and Islamic fundamentalist ideology. The conspirators had planned their operation carefully. They had identified a specific military unit that would participate in the parade, a unit that could be positioned to pass near the reviewing stand. They had ensured that sympathetic soldiers would be part of that unit. They had arranged for weapons to be available, and for the soldiers to have the opportunity to break formation and carry out the assassination. The plan was designed to accomplish several objectives. First, it would kill Sadat and remove him from power. Second, it would demonstrate that the military was divided and that opposition to Sadat existed within the armed forces. Third, it was intended to be a catalyst for broader uprising. The conspirators believed that Sadat's death would inspire popular uprisings against his government, and that Islamic fundamentalists would be able to take advantage of the chaos to stage a revolution. In some ways, the conspirators were correct in their assessment that Sadat's death would create chaos and uncertainty. What they were incorrect about was whether this would lead to an Islamic fundamentalist takeover. The Egyptian military was not as divided as they had hoped. While there were pockets of Islamic fundamentalist sympathy within the military, the institution as a whole remained under secular control. When the assassination happened, the military closed ranks and maintained control of the country. After Sadat's death, many of the conspirators were arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. The trials were highly publicized and became important events in Egyptian history. During the trials, the conspirators explained their motivations. They spoke about their religious beliefs, their opposition to the Camp David Accords, their anger at Sadat's secular policies, and their conviction that they had been right to attempt his assassination. Al-Islambuli and several other conspirators were executed for their role in the assassination. Their executions were also public events, serving as a demonstration that the government would not tolerate political violence. But the executions also made the conspirators martyrs in the eyes of Islamic fundamentalist groups. They had died for their cause, and some viewed them as having sacrificed themselves for Islam. The aftermath of the assassination revealed a broader network of Islamic fundamentalist activity within Egypt. Investigators discovered that Islamic Jihad and related groups had been planning not just Sadat's assassination, but also potentially a broader attempt to overthrow the government. Hundreds of people were arrested in the weeks and months following the assassination. When Sadat died, Egypt faced an immediate succession crisis. Who would become the next president? How would the transition of power occur? What would happen to the government without Sadat's leadership? The Constitution of Egypt provided that if the president died, the vice president would assume the presidency. At the time of Sadat's assassination, the vice president was Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak had been a military officer and had held various positions in Sadat's government. He had been named vice president earlier in 1981. Within hours of Sadat's death, Mubarak was sworn in as president of Egypt. This immediate succession provided continuity and prevented a power vacuum from developing. The military closed ranks around Mubarak, signaling that the institution would maintain control and that there would be no opportunity for Islamic fundamentalist groups to exploit the chaos. Mubarak's first actions as president were focused on securing control and preventing any attempt to destabilize the government further. He declared martial law. He deployed the military throughout Cairo and other major cities. He implemented a crackdown on suspected Islamic fundamentalists and political opposition figures. The security forces arrested hundreds of people in the weeks following the assassination. Many of these were members of Islamic fundamentalist organizations. Others were simply suspected of sympathizing with the assassins. The arrests were widespread, and in many cases, based on suspicion rather than concrete evidence of involvement in the assassination plot. Mubarak also made it clear that he would continue many of Sadat's policies. He reaffirmed Egypt's commitment to the peace treaty with Israel. He maintained Egypt's position as a close ally of the United States. He kept the secular nationalist orientation of the government. In this sense, Despite Sadat's death, the fundamental direction of Egypt's government did not change. The investigation into the assassination continued for months. More details emerged about the conspiracy. The extent of the planning and the involvement of multiple people became clear. The trials of the conspirators provided a public accounting of what had happened and why. One significant aspect of the aftermath was the international reaction. Governments around the world condemned the assassination and expressed support for the continuity of Egypt's government. The United States moved quickly to support Mubarak, understanding that Egypt was a crucial ally in the Middle East. Israel also expressed support for Egypt's government and for continuity in the peace treaty. However, there was also a segment of Arab opinion that viewed Sadat's death sympathetically. Some Arab commentators and activists saw the assassination as justified, as a response to Sadat's betrayal of the Arab cause through his peace with Israel. This sympathetic view of the assassination was a minority opinion in official government circles, but it existed among certain segments of the Arab world. The assassination also had significant religious dimensions in how it was understood. Islamic fundamentalist groups used the assassination as a rallying point. They portrayed the conspirators as martyrs who had died fighting against a secular, un-Islamic government. This narrative was influential among young, ideologically committed Islamic activists who saw Sadat's death as a victory for their cause, even though the aftermath had not gone as they had hoped. The assassination of Sadat needs to be understood not just as an isolated event, but as part of a broader historical and political context. Several factors converged to make 1981 a moment of particular tension and danger in Egypt. First, there was the issue of the Camp David Accords and the peace with Israel. This was deeply controversial not just internationally, but within Egypt itself. While many Egyptians appreciated the cessation of hostilities with Israel and the economic benefits that could come from peace, many others saw the peace treaty as a betrayal of Arab solidarity and the Palestinian cause. This disagreement was not just between different groups, but sometimes within families and close relationships. Second, there was growing Islamic fundamentalist activism throughout the Middle East. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Iranian Revolution had occurred in 1979, demonstrating that an Islamic fundamentalist movement could successfully overthrow a secular government. This inspired Islamic fundamentalist groups throughout the region, including in Egypt. These groups saw the Iranian example as proof that their ideology could succeed and that secular governments could be overthrown through determined action. Third, Sadat's government had been cracking down on opposition groups more severely in the period leading up to the assassination. The arrests in September 1981 had been particularly extensive. Sadat was attempting to suppress opposition, but in doing so, he was also radicalizing some of his opponents. People who had been arrested felt they had nothing left to lose. Some became more committed to violent resistance after experiencing government detention. Fourth, there were economic tensions within Egypt. While Sadat's policies had brought some economic benefits, particularly from the reopened Suez Canal and foreign aid, there were also significant economic disparities and unemployment. Young people, particularly young men in the military, were struggling economically. This economic frustration provided a recruiting ground for Islamic fundamentalist organizations that offered both an ideology and a sense of purpose and belonging. Fifth, the military officer corps contained significant ideological diversity. While the institution was ultimately under secular nationalist control, individual officers and soldiers held various political and religious views. Some were sympathetic to Islamic fundamentalism. Others were nationalists who opposed the peace with Israel, but were not necessarily religious fundamentalists. This diversity meant that the military was not monolithic in its support for Sadat's policies. The assassination of Sadat was significant historically for several reasons. First, it demonstrated the vulnerability of even heavily guarded leaders. Sadat had been president of Egypt for over a decade. He had consolidated power. He was surrounded by security forces. Yet he was killed by members of his own military in a direct, violent attack. This showed that no amount of power or security measures could guarantee complete protection against determined internal opponents. Second, the assassination revealed the depth of Islamic fundamentalist opposition to secular Arab governments. It was not just rhetoric or political opposition. It involved concrete planning and willingness to use violence. This was significant because it signaled that Islamic fundamentalism was becoming a serious political and security threat in the Middle East, not just a religious or cultural phenomenon. Third, the assassination had significant regional implications. It made clear to other Arab leaders who had made peace with Israel or had good relations with the West that they faced serious internal security threats. It influenced how these leaders approached security and how they balanced their international relationships with domestic opposition. Fourth, the way that Mubarak handled the aftermath, through consolidating power, cracking down on opposition, and continuing Sadat's policies, set a pattern for his own rule. Mubarak would remain in power for nearly 3 decades, and his approach to governance was significantly shaped by his experience of succeeding to power through assassination. The assassination also became historically significant in how it was remembered and commemorated. In Arab and Islamic fundamentalist circles, the conspirators became controversial figures, viewed by some as martyrs and by others as terrorists. The different ways that different groups understood and commemorated the assassination reflected deeper disagreements about the direction of Arab politics and the role of Islamic fundamentalism. More than 4 decades have passed since Sadat's assassination, and yet its legacy continues to shape Middle Eastern politics and history. The events of October 6, 1981 raise questions that are still relevant today about the nature of political violence, religious ideology, and governance in the Arab world. One significant legacy is how the assassination influenced approaches to security and governance. Mubarak's experience with Sadat's assassination led him to implement extensive security measures and a pervasive security state. Secret police and intelligence services expanded dramatically. Surveillance of citizens became more common. This was justified as necessary to prevent further assassinations and terrorism, but it also had the effect of suppressing political opposition and limiting freedoms. The assassination also influenced how Islamic fundamentalist movements were understood and addressed. In the immediate aftermath, Egyptian government and security forces took Islamic Jihad and related organizations extremely seriously. Hundreds of people were imprisoned. The government implemented extensive surveillance and intelligence operations focused on Islamic fundamentalist groups. This created a cycle. The government crackdown radicalized some people, which in turn led to more violence, which justified more crackdowns. From the perspective of Islamic fundamentalist groups, the assassination had significant symbolic importance, even though it did not achieve its immediate political objective of overthrowing Sadat's government. The conspirators had demonstrated that a determined group could strike at even the most powerful figures. The fact that the conspirators were willing to become martyrs showed commitment to the cause. The conspirators' trials and executions provided opportunities for public statements about their ideology and their opposition to Sadat's government. The assassination also influenced how observers understood the relationship between military institutions and Islamic fundamentalism. It was not the case that the military was monolithic and entirely secular. Within the military, there existed compartments of people sympathetic to Islamic fundamentalist ideology. This meant that security challenges were not just external, but could come from within institutions themselves. In terms of its impact on Middle East politics broadly, Sadat's assassination reinforced the conflict between secular nationalism and Islamic fundamentalism. Sadat had represented secular Arab nationalism, the idea that Egypt should be governed by secular principles based on national identity rather than religious identity. His peace with Israel was based on a calculation about Egypt's national interests, not on religious considerations. His assassination by Islamic fundamentalists represented a direct challenge to this worldview. The assassination also occurred at a moment when the balance between secular and Islamic political movements was beginning to shift. In the 1960s and 1970s, secular nationalist movements had been dominant in the Arab world. By the 1980s, Islamic fundamentalist movements were becoming increasingly influential. Sadat's death was partly a symptom of this larger shift. The way that Mubarak consolidated power after the assassination also had lasting effects. Mubarak's approach was to combine continuation of Sadat's foreign policy with intensified internal security measures and political control. He maintained the peace with Israel and good relations with the United States, but he also created what many observers viewed as an authoritarian system with limited political freedoms. This approach shaped Egypt's political development for 3 decades. It is worth noting that despite the hopes of the Islamic fundamentalist conspirators, The assassination did not lead to the overthrow of Egypt's secular government or the establishment of an Islamic state. The military institution proved resilient and maintained control. The transition of power was smooth and orderly. The government remained in place, and continuity was maintained. In this sense, the assassination failed to achieve its primary objective. Yet it had profound effects on how Egypt was governed and on the trajectory of Middle Eastern politics. In recent years, scholars and historians have examined the Sadat assassination as a crucial moment in the history of Islamic fundamentalism and Middle Eastern politics. The assassination is studied as an example of how ideological conviction can motivate individuals to commit political violence. It is examined as a moment when the future direction of Egypt's political development was in question, and as an example of how institutional resilience and military coherence prevented the kind of breakdown that the conspirators had hoped for. The assassination is also studied in the context of the broader phenomenon of political violence in the Middle East. It represents one of the most high-profile cases of a sitting head of state being assassinated in the region. It demonstrates both the possibility and the limitations of political assassination as a tool of change. Anwar Sadat's assassination on October 6, 1981, was a watershed moment in Middle Eastern history. A president who had been in power for over a decade, who had negotiated peace with Israel, who was considered one of the Arab world's most powerful leaders, was killed in broad daylight by members of his own military. The assassination revealed deep divisions within Egyptian society, between those who supported Sadat's secular vision and foreign policy, and those who opposed them on Islamic and nationalist grounds. It demonstrated the capacity of ideologically motivated groups to plan and execute sophisticated political violence. It showed how vulnerability existed even at the highest levels of power. Yet the assassination also demonstrated the resilience of state institutions. The military closed ranks, the government maintained control, a successor was smoothly installed. The fundamental direction of Egypt's foreign and domestic policy did not change. The conspirators hoped that the assassination would trigger broader upheaval and lead to the overthrow of the government proved unfounded. The legacy of Sadat's assassination continues to influence Middle Eastern politics today. It shaped how governments approach security. It demonstrated the appeal of Islamic fundamentalism as an ideology of opposition to secular governance. It showed how personal conviction and religious belief could motivate individuals to commit acts that would have enormous historical consequences. The man who ordered the assassination, Khalid al-Islambuli, was executed for his role in the conspiracy, but his act ensured that both he and the cause he died for would be remembered. In the decades since, Islamic fundamentalist movements have played an increasingly significant role in Middle Eastern politics. Whether this was a result of Sadat's death, or whether the assassination was merely one manifestation of broader historical currents, remains a subject of historical debate. What is clear is that the morning of October 6, 1981 in Cairo, changed the course of Egyptian and Middle Eastern history. A president was killed, a nation was thrown into crisis, and then maintained control through institutional resilience. And the world watched as political ideology turned into violence and altered the trajectory of events for millions of people. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.